Thank you.
When to share.
So, what I thought I'd do. So, thank you all for joining, and that's an amazing international audience. So, thank you so much. When I discussed this with Evan in particular a few months ago, what we thought might be helpful is, I think at that stage we hadn't quite. I think that was back in October, wasn't it? And we hadn't at that stage quite published the Scotland, let alone the Wales research. But albeit they were in an advanced condition, we now have, and I'll touch on that in a second. So what I thought I would do today is try to avoid death by PowerPoint. So I've just done a few slides, just a very high level overview of the genesis of this research, a little bit about the methods and approaches, then a little bit then about the key findings. I will go a little bit into some of the key figures, but as any of you that will have, if you've ever had the chance to look at any of the data in the research, there's a plethora of information there, covering many different facets of book selling. I'll touch a little bit then about some of the enablers and barriers that we identified, and a little bit then about some of the recommendations, which span recommendations for governments and policymakers, but also for partners in the book trade and for the Booksellers Association itself. So if that's okay. And then what I'd love to be able to do then, time permitting, because I don't want to take too much time doing that, is then opening it up to your questions and comments, etc. So if that's okay with everybody, we'll approach it that way. So Evan, do you want to do kind of your gonna, I think you've got the slide control there. Do you want to kind of pitch through to the? I think I probably covered the first one. So there we are. That's what I've just said in so many words. So do you mind going to the next slide? There we are. Super. So just in terms of the background to these pieces of research, the genesis of it, as I say, went back quite a few years, where obviously the team at the Booksellers Association, what they were particularly conscious of is that they know so many bookshops across the breadth of the UK and Ireland do amazing work on a cultural and community basis. But what we weren't able to do is aggregate all that together, in terms of providing some compelling facts and figures, but also then to develop if you like, the stories and the narrative around that. So coming up from conversations that Merrill Halls had, who is the many of you will know Merrill, of course, but Merrill is the outstanding managing director of the Booksellers Association, and Merrill had been seeking to engage the people at the Arts Council of England, who are the sort of public body that provide a lot of funding for arts and cultural bodies in England. And she was able to persuade them to put up a little bit of money to enable me to go and do this research. And basically, what the research in England, so this started literally about 2 years ago. Yeah, 2 years ago in January 2024, and essentially it was looking to do two core things, which was first of all to better understand the role that independent bookshops play in enriching the cultural lives of their communities, and the extent to which, and then also then what it was looking to do was then identify what are the enablers for all that activity, but also then identify what the barriers are and what could be done to try to remove some of those barriers, and so help sustain that work going forward. So that was the first piece of work we did, and I'll just say a little bit about why, because that was being funded by the Arts Council, that's why it had a focus specifically on independent bookshops. As the research projects then have developed over the last 2 years, and in particular then as the Booksellers Association took over the funding of them, we were able to extend the scope so that it took in chains, in particular Waterstones, and obviously in Ireland we were able to get input from companies like Eason as well. So just explain a little bit about the different variable geometry there in terms of the type of bookshops that we covered. What that then led to was, as the slide sets out there, we published the report then on England in September 2024. There was one on Ireland then that followed very, very quickly. Just a little bit about the Ireland report. The particular stimulus for the Irish report was minds were being concentrated in the Irish bookselling community with the ramping up of Amazon and its operations there. And in addition to that, there were some quite big structural changes being driven through the Irish market because of the changes that the Irish government was making to how school books were being funded. So that was why we did Ireland next. And once those two reports had been done, quite rightly, bookshops in Wales and Scotland. So actually, this is really interesting, really helpful. We'd like similar reports done there. So that then led to me being commissioned to do the piece on Scotland, which, as the slide says, was published in November, and then the Wales report coming up almost to date now, which was published in January. And what we were really delighted with that, because clearly when you do this, it's an iterative process, and you learn things along the way. And one of the great things the team at the BA were able to secure is we were able to launch it at the Welsh Parliament, the Welsh Senedd in January. So that was fantastic, and we had over 10% of Welsh members of the Senedd came along to the launch event. So that was fantastic. We had really good media coverage on that as well, and indeed we'd had good media coverage on the Scotland report as well. So just to give you a sense of how this has developed over the last couple of years. I am biased, of course, having sort of authored them, but what we hope we provided here is an unprecedented depth and breadth of picture in terms of the cultural contribution across Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland. For completeness' sake, and I've used the term Great Britain deliberately there, the only part of the geography that we haven't been able to cover is Northern Ireland. So just when we did Ireland, it was specifically the Republic of Ireland. So anyway, so that's the background to this. Eben, would you kindly move on to the next slide? Thank you. In terms of the research methods, we used a mix of quantitative and qualitative approaches. So the central element of every one of the reports was a survey went out to every single, in the case of England, every single independent bookshop in England, and then in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, it went out to pretty much every bookshop that was in BA membership. And we got a fantastic response. So in England, obviously that's by far the largest market, and I can't remember the exact sort of figures off the top of my head, but it's not far shy of 1,000 independent members, if memory serves me. And we got about 160 responses, which, as any of you will know when you're doing surveys, that equated about a 15% response rate, and that was fantastic. So to get 160 responses across 36 questions, that gave us a wealth of both quantitative and qualitative insights. The response rates then in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland got even better. So they were in the sort of 45 to 50% response rate, and that was, you know, that was it. That was incredible. One of the points of interest that we did with Wales is obviously the Welsh language is a very important component of book selling in Wales. So one thing we did with the survey in Wales is it went out in Welsh and English, giving booksellers there the option to respond in either language. And you know, what we were delighted is that we got an almost 40% of the responses were in Welsh. So you know, that really added to the rich cultural texture, and you know, told a very important story in its own right, which when I come to talk a little bit later about some of the policy recommendations, you know, that added real weight to that. In addition, what I then did, and this was a real privilege being able to do this, I travelled across Scotland, Wales, England, and Ireland, and I was able to visit many of the bookshops that were exemplars of you know, cultural and community engagement in different ways. And it was surprising when I totted it up preparing for this talk this afternoon. It came to 77 bookshops there that I either visited in person or did an on-screen interview with. And as any of you will know, there's no substitute for actually being there in person, having that face-to-face conversation, but also being able to just notice some of those small things. Sometimes it's a small interaction the bookseller might be having with a customer, etc., and you build up a really rich picture of how they support and relate to their community. The other thing we did is and particularly then, as I say, as we developed the process, I reflected on how we could maybe strengthen the research. So, you know, by the time I was doing Scotland and Wales, for example, I was really keen to speak to a wider group of stakeholders. In particular, for example, in the case of Wales and Scotland, we're able to talk to local publishers, also, you know, libraries and other literary organisations. And the other thing, obviously, that helped inform the research and is referenced in all of the research pieces we did is some of the existing research that had been done. So, you know, it'd only be right, for example, to mention the really helpful research that Audrey, who's, you know, on the call this afternoon, had done in Scotland, looking at the contribution of bookshops there, independent bookshops in Scotland. So that was really helpful to see, you know, what was there already. So yeah, so you know, a massive data and insights, which, you know, I think provided that genuinely unprecedented comprehensive picture, and with characteristic generosity, booksellers across the countries, you know, supported that in a really meaningful way. Could we move on to the next slide, Evan? Thank you. So key sort of findings. Can I just ask as well? I don't know if we can do a show of hands. Whether how many of you have actually been able to read or access any of the reports? I'm holding the one for Scotland up here, and there's similar ones. So I've got two hands there. Is it? And we got Audrey. Yep, brilliant. And we get okay. All right. So I'm getting any other takers? Anybody else want to put a thumbs up to that? Okay, so that's helpful. That helps me judge then how many of you have been able to actually read any of that. So in terms of the key findings, as I say right at the very top there, what was fantastic, and it did this you know, very powerfully, it confirmed that view of bookshops as I say, as hugely vibrant and vital community and cultural actors. If you have a chance to have a look at any of the reports, they're on the BA website. You know, the figures are really they're really powerful in terms of that the huge contribution that's made by sort of bookshops. So if I just give you, you know, one example from England, for example, is that 92% there of those people that responded, you know, hold author events, 60% run book and reading clubs, and nearly 1 in 2 of independent bookshops in England organise 20 plus events per year. So I think hopefully that starts to give a sense of the the reach and extent and the energy that is behind all this amazing activity. Um, if we look then at Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, again, one of the very powerful insights that came through was that distinct cultural contribution to supporting the indigenous languages and literatures in those countries. Similarly, across all the countries, there's a really powerful claim that bookshops can rightly make, that how they champion writers and publishers, and obviously that role of supporting publishers in the smaller countries, where you don't have the huge market that you have in England, for example. That's really, really important. And again, what we were very keen to do is actually highlight the importance of that, because sometimes, and I'll come on to this a little bit in the recommendations, some of the relationship and between bookshops and publishers can be a little bit uneven, and actually it's really important actually to be able to demonstrate just how intrinsic those committed booksellers are to the um, survival and sustainability of local publishers and writers. Again, that was very powerful, and probably the country that gets if they were to edge it, probably Ireland, in terms of the just that strength of the and intimacy of the links between their writers and their bookshops. And very often, I think as well, the writers, even when they become very successful, they remember the time when they were not well known, and how local bookshops helped get them on the map, and they continue repaying that that loyalty. The other strands then to touch on are a really important supporting role on children's literacy, and that went across all the countries. And I think obviously there's as I understand it, there's in the age of all the social media distractions, etc. That role, and also post COVID with some of the reading loss that we experience here in the UK, that continues to be really, really important. And then finally, then there was some really interesting pockets of pioneering approaches to inclusion. So, for example, some really fine work done by bookshops to make themselves more inclusive and accessible for people on the autistic spectrum, for example, and similarly work done on employability. So again, what was really great with the research is we wanted to be able to highlight to other booksellers some of the best practice that was out there. So it was a great way of being able to highlight that. So yeah, so those are the sort of key findings at a headline level. Evan, would you kindly move on to the next slide? Thank you. So I'm going to try to stick to that good rubric about not giving too many facts or figures. If you do get a chance after this talk to have a look at any of the pieces of research, you'll see there's a plethora of data in there. Our designer, Jo, I cannot claim any of the credit for this. She did a fantastic job of doing broken out pie charts. I don't know where you can see any of that. It's probably too small on that, but she really brought the data alive there. So there's a whole raft of things there. The figures, I think, speak for themselves there, in terms of the reach and the excellence of what bookshops do. And as I touched on just a few moments ago, in particular in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, there's some very strong work there to support the local minority, indigenous languages, and that's really, really, important. But I have to say, sort of common strands across all 4 countries in terms of the, working to promote authors, working to either create their own literary and arts festivals, or working and collaborating with others. And I think that's one of the other really fine elements that booksellers distinguish themselves by is that collaborative ability. It's really admirable, and it's very sort of far spread. So, Evan, would you kindly move on to the next slide? Thank you. I mentioned that as well as measuring and all the good work that's done and seeking to present the best practice examples, one of the other key aims of this research was to identify what we said were enablers and barriers. So, understand what it is that encourages booksellers to do all this activity, but also then understanding what the what the barriers are. In terms of enablers, I think would say a lot of it is actually just that innate passion that so many booksellers and bookshops have for connecting their local communities with the best of literature, be that a local author, a regional author, a national author, or indeed an international author. And as I mentioned, that sort of fantastic collaborative ability, but also the generosity with which that is done. So, for example, across all the countries, most of the time, the bookshops are actually doing it themselves, and funding a lot of it themselves. What, as the figure there from Scotland, but it's pretty representative of the picture as a whole, is that there is some public funding available in different pockets, but it's not always easy to access, and it's not always easy to access, especially where you have newly established bookshops who might just need a little bit of helping kind, or just a small outlay of money to enable them to pay for an author to travel to their part of the country and put them up overnight. So when we're not talking about money that's necessarily going into the pockets of the bookshop, but just for them to facilitate that. But they're also fantastic at audience creation. So that's one of the other sort of elements coming out from that. The figure there I've cited about 71% of England's indies desiring more support from event partners like publishers. That was a common strand and theme, running across all the different surveys. So again, I know the very good people at the BA will be using this data on an ongoing basis to inform those. I hope we're close to continuous conversations with publishers to encourage more best practice on that, because many of them do good stuff, but I think there's always a need for them to do more and have them mirror held up to them. And this might be obviously less relevant to many of you in the wider international audience here, but the business taxes paid across Ireland and the UK, what are called business rates, which are paid for your presence in the high street. That's a continually thorny issue for many booksellers, and many across England, for example, at the moment are facing potentially quite big increases, which could affect their viability. So that that was really important to continue to highlight that. And I think we're almost at the end, Evan. I think there might be another slide there. I'm going on to super. So I'm going on to the final slide now. Recommendations. I counted up earlier, they overlap a little bit, but there's some across the different reports. There are something like 80 different recommendations. What we were able to do, they are less explicit in the original one on England, because we had to be a little bit cute because of Arts Council funding, and some of the recommendations are actually for the Arts Council and how they change things. So there were, between everybody on this call, there are recommendations there, but we didn't put them as explicitly in the report. They're being worked on by the BA team. But the the good thing was then that when the BA took over, if you like, the funding for all of these other reports, I was able to be pretty, I was able to be even more explicit in terms of the recommendations, and it was done on a kind of no fear or favor basis. Um, I was holding the light up to the BA as well. So you will see if you have a chance to look at those recommendations, there are recommendations for the BA to improve their own practices and approaches as well. So yeah, so a range of things there across the piece. I've highlighted there just to give you a flavour of some of the different ones coming through. So one of the things we recommended in Ireland, which I think they are now looking to do it, and in Scotland and Wales, is this idea of culture vouchers. And Tora will know because the EA did a lot of really important work there to promote this idea of culture vouchers, and they're operating already across continental Europe. So that's so the idea there is at the age of either 16 or 18 that every young person is given a voucher to say to the value of 250 euros or 300 euros, which they have will last for about 5 years, and they can spend it going to a concert, an art gallery, or they can spend it on books. And I understand from Germany, for example, that a significant share of the young people there they spend their culture voucher on books. The other areas there are hopefully sort of self explanatory. One longer term piece, which is the final bullet there, about this need for bookshops to be seen as cultural as well as retail spaces. That was something that struck me when I was reflecting on the findings here and how people see things. I think actually it's really important for policymakers in particular, but society more generally, to not just to look at bookshops as retail spaces, important as that is and clearly central to their function, but also to see them and view them as cultural spaces. So we end up as a society with a more rounded and I hope sophisticated appreciation of that distinctive contribution that bookshops make to our communities. And in a way, then that leads me on to the final point there that I made in the end of the Scotland report and the Wales report, is that I think from this research, my ask would be that they are assets. They are cultural and social assets for their communities, and that distinctive role should be better known, it should be celebrated, and it should be better supported as well. So I will stop on that. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you. That was some great stuff there. You've seen a lot of the UK now, of Great Britain.
Indeed, that was part of the privilege of it. Absolutely, yes.
I'm sure it was an enjoyable bit of research for the most part.
Hugely, a real privilege. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.